When people first heard the name Whittaker, it was usually followed by silence, a pause of disbelief, or a whisper of shock. But for Mark Laita, that name became a story he could never walk away from. A story that would reveal 7 truths, some heartbreaking, some misunderstood, and some so strange they still divide the internet today. Mark had gone deep into forgotten America before. He'd photographed the edges of society, the outcasts, the poor, the unseen. But nothing could have prepared him for Odd, West Virginia, or the family that would change the course of his life and career. He'd heard about them years before he ever met them. Whispers of a family so isolated, so unlike anything outsiders could comprehend, that even locals hesitated to approach their home. The word inbred floated around in hushed tones, often paired with pity, disgust, or dark curiosity. But for Mark, it wasn't gossip he was chasing. It was humanity. And that pursuit led him straight into one of the most extraordinary and controversial encounters ever caught on film. The first time Mark drove into Odd, it didn't feel like entering a town. It felt like crossing a line into another time. Old pickup trucks rusted in fields, mailboxes stood crooked, and nature had swallowed most of what used to be paved roads. He didn't have an address, just directions scribbled by someone who told him, "You'll know it when you get there." And he did. The Whittaker home sat at the end of a narrow dirt road, guarded by barking dogs and an eerie quiet. It wasn't the poverty that struck Mark first. It was the stillness, a kind of silence that felt alive, watching. When he stepped out of his car, 3 pairs of eyes appeared from behind the porch railing. They didn't speak, but they didn't hide either. Then came the sounds, grunts, short barks, an almost rhythmic repetition of noises that Mark couldn't immediately understand. That was his introduction to Timmy. Timmy didn't use words, but he communicated through expressions, gestures, and guttural sounds that conveyed more emotion than most conversations ever could. Mark didn't take a single photo that first visit. He simply stood there, uncertain whether to leave or stay. It was the kind of moment where the line between curiosity and intrusion blurred. But something in their eyes, confusion, trust, and a quiet kind of innocence, pulled him back. Thing number 1. The Whittakers' isolation wasn't just geographical, it was generational. When Mark started digging into their background, what he discovered stunned him. The family's isolation wasn't born out of choice, but of circumstance. The Whittakers had lived in the same region for generations, their lives shaped by poverty, lack of access, and a collapsing social structure. The roads to Odd weren't just difficult, they were barriers. Schools were miles away, jobs scarcer still, and medical care nearly non-existent. Over time, those barriers hardened into walls. And behind those walls, the family became its own world. Generations passed without intervention or escape. Outsiders rarely came. Those who did never stayed long. By the time Mark met them, they had been living in almost complete social isolation for decades. It wasn't just that the Whittakers didn't leave, it was that nobody came in. That solitude had shaped their minds, their mannerisms, and their very understanding of communication. It was in every sense a life untouched by modern society. Thing number 2, Mark wasn't the first to find the Whittakers, but he was the first to see them. Long before his now famous video, people in nearby towns had known about the Whittakers. Some claimed to have seen them in grocery stores or along the dirt road that led to their house. Others spread stories, cruel, exaggerated, and often false, about their condition. Mark learned that previous visitors had tried to photograph them. Some had even offered money, but none had returned. They didn't see people, Mark later said. They saw sideshow material. What made Mark different was empathy. He didn't approach them like an exhibit. He approached them like a human story, messy, uncomfortable, and real. It took years for him to gain their trust. His camera didn't come out until the second visit, and even then only with quiet consent. He would bring food, water, and supplies. He'd sit on the porch with them for hours, saying little, listening more. Slowly, the family opened up, not through words, but through presence. When Mark finally began filming, he captured something raw that the internet had never seen before: unfiltered human survival. Thing number 3. Their communication was a language of its own. For most viewers, the sounds and gestures made by some family members were shocking, even unsettling. Many couldn't understand what they were hearing. But what appeared to be chaos to outsiders was actually its own system. Within the family, those grunts, hand movements, and expressions carried meaning. Mark observed how one sound could mean hunger, another could mean recognition, and subtle differences in tone could indicate emotion. It was an improvised language born of necessity, shaped over generations where formal speech had eroded or never developed due to genetic and developmental limitations. Mark never mocked or sensationalized this. He showed it for what it was: a survival mechanism, a testament to how the human brain adapts when cut off from conventional tools. He said later, "They understood more than people think. They felt more than people gave them credit for." The first video Mark released in 2020 was met with shock, not just for what it showed, but for how it made people feel. Millions watched in disbelief. The comments section filled with words like heartbreaking, disturbing, and eye-opening. But with that attention came something else: scrutiny. Thing number 4. The backlash almost ended the entire project. Within days of the video going viral, Mark found himself at the center of an ethical storm. Critics accused him of exploiting a vulnerable family. Others accused him of manipulating footage for views. But Mark pushed back, not defensively, but carefully. He explained that the family had given permission, that they understood he was helping them. He clarified that he had provided support, groceries, medical contact, and even housing improvements over time. Still, the controversy grew. The internet's moral pendulum swung wildly, one moment praising him for shedding light on poverty, the next condemning him for profiting off suffering. Through it all, Mark kept visiting. He didn't abandon the Whittakers when the internet turned cruel. Instead, he doubled down on compassion. He said in an interview, "If the internet is going to talk about them, they deserve to be represented truthfully. I'm here to make sure that happens." Thing number 5. The family's home is a time capsule. Mark described the Whittakers' house as a place frozen in another era. Inside, the furniture was worn to threads, walls covered in soot, floors uneven and creaking. The air was heavy, part damp, part smoke, part memory. Electricity flickered inconsistently. The kitchen had no modern appliances. Old photographs and trinkets lay scattered, remnants of decades untouched by change. And yet, amid the decay, there was warmth, laughter, the sound of dogs, the rhythm of life that persisted even when comfort didn't. Mark saw dignity in that. "They don't see themselves as tragic," he said once. "They see themselves as family. And that's something we've forgotten how to see." But even as he grew closer to the family, new truths began to surface, truths that would divide his audience even more. Mark learned things during his visits that he didn't share immediately. Some because they were too personal, others because they were too dangerous to expose publicly. And that's where the real story began. The parts no one saw, the details that explain how a family like the Whittakers came to be, and what their existence says about us as a society. Thing number 6. The town knew and stayed silent. When Mark began asking around odd, most locals had the same reaction: a shake of the head, a muttered, "Leave it be." People knew about the Whittakers. They knew for generations. But no one intervened. Some justified it as respecting their privacy. Others simply didn't want to be involved. A few even admitted to being afraid, not of violence, but of what the family represented. Mark realized that the Whittakers were not just a symptom of isolation, they were a reflection of systemic neglect. Poverty had trapped them, but silence had doomed them. "They're not inbred monsters," Mark once said in frustration. "They're victims of a system that forgot them." That statement would later define his work. Thing number 7. What Mark found wasn't just poverty, it was resilience. Despite everything, the ridicule, the hardships, the exposure, the Whittakers endured. Mark saw how they cared for each other. How Larry looked after the younger members. How Betty tried to keep the home intact. How, even in confusion, there was loyalty. He said, "They love one another in ways we can't measure by our standards. It's pure. It's instinctive. It's what keeps them alive." Those 7 truths became the foundation of Mark's understanding, and the reason he never turned his back on the family. But they were just the beginning. Because behind those truths was something Mark hadn't yet revealed, the darker realities of fame, money, and manipulation that would follow once the world discovered the Whittakers. And that's where the story turns, when compassion meets corruption, and when telling the truth becomes a battle of its own. Comment below. After learning these 7 revelations, do you think Mark Laita did the right thing by sharing the Whittaker family's story? Or did exposing their world open a door that should have stayed closed? Hey everyone, before we get into the next part, I've got something special to share with you. If you're all about making your home smarter, cozier, and just a little bit more you, then you've got to check this out. We've partnered with trekbo.com, a place built for people who love clever solutions and everyday comfort. From wellness and skincare must-haves to smart home gadgets, heated gear, and lifestyle tech, Trekbo is packed with products that make life easier, warmer, and way more fun. I've personally picked some of my favorite finds, things that actually work, look great, and make your day smoother. Whether it's something to simplify your morning routine, help you unwind after a long day, or bring a little innovation into your home, you'll find it there. So before you scroll past, take a quick look at trekbo.com. Trust me, it's full of discoveries waiting to make your everyday better. Alright, now let's get back to it, because after this video, you're definitely going to want to explore what Trekbo has in store for the Whittaker household community. When Mark Laita's first video on the Whittaker family went viral, the internet couldn't look away. Millions of people clicked play, not realizing they were about to see something that would shake them, not through spectacle, but through discomfort. At first, it was curiosity that drove the views. Who are these people? Why did they live that way? But soon, curiosity turned into obsession. Forums, Facebook groups, and YouTube channels started dissecting every frame. People debated ethics, questioned Mark's motives, and made wild claims about the family's past. Mark hadn't expected that level of reaction. He knew the footage was powerful, but he didn't realize how easily compassion could twist into exploitation once the internet got involved. And behind the screens, the Whittakers themselves had no idea how big the storm had become. When Mark returned to Odd, West Virginia, a few weeks after the video's explosion, he found the small dirt road to the Whittaker home busier than he'd ever seen. Cars he didn't recognize were parked nearby. Strangers, some with cameras, were wandering around, calling out names they'd learned online. Mark froze. He had expected attention, maybe even local news coverage. But not this. Not the swarm of people treating a private family like a roadside attraction. He stepped out of his truck and confronted one of them, a man holding a phone mounted on a stabilizer. "You shouldn't be here," Mark said firmly. The man shrugged. "It's public land. Everyone wants to see them. We're fans." That word, fans, landed like a slap. The Whittakers weren't performers. They weren't actors or celebrities. They were a family who had lived their entire lives unseen, and now the world had seen too much. Thing number 1. Fame arrived like a curse. Mark later described that moment as the beginning of the family's second isolation. This time, not from geography, but from the internet itself. They were famous but not free. People came from miles away hoping to catch a glimpse of Timmy barking or Larry pacing the porch. Some filmed without asking, others shouted questions, and a few left money or food as if that balanced the intrusion. Mark had tried to protect them. He blurred certain faces, withheld last names, and avoided revealing their exact address. But it didn't matter. The internet has a way of finding what it wants. The Whittakers were now part of a global spectacle, and Mark was at the center of it. He started getting hundreds of messages a day. Some were kind, offers to help, donations, prayers. Others were cruel, calling him a poverty pimp or the man exploiting the disabled. In one interview, Mark admitted, "I didn't expect the backlash to come from me. I thought people would understand. But the internet doesn't understand nuance. It turns empathy into entertainment." Thing number 2, the GoFundMe mystery. After the video's success, Mark launched a GoFundMe campaign to help improve the Whittakers' living conditions. He was transparent at first. He posted updates, receipts, and photos showing where funds were going. But as donations grew, so did suspicion. Internet watchdogs began to question the accounting. Critics demanded proof of every dollar spent. Others accused Mark of pocketing profits from YouTube views. He addressed the accusations head-on in a follow-up video. "The money went where I said it would," he explained. "They have heat, beds, plumbing, and groceries. Every bit of it went to them." Still, doubts persisted. Screenshots circulated online, supposedly showing inconsistencies in payment dates. Some claimed the family hadn't received as much as promised. Mark tried to reach out directly to clarify, but the noise was too loud. Once a narrative takes hold online, truth becomes almost irrelevant. And yet, behind all the noise, there was a real question, one that haunted even those who supported him. Can you ever truly help someone by putting them on display? Thing number 3, the family's mixed feelings. When Mark visited again, he noticed the difference right away. Larry seemed quieter. Betty avoided eye contact. Timmy still smiled when he saw him, but the warmth felt tinged with confusion. They didn't understand what viral meant, but they understood attention. Too much of it. Neighbors had begun whispering. Some were angry about the sudden spotlight on Odd. Others envied the donations the family had received. A few even accused them of acting for the camera. Mark sat on the porch with Betty one evening as the sun dipped behind the hills. She looked at him and said softly, "You brought all this here." She didn't say it with anger, just truth. Mark nodded, unable to respond. He had wanted to help, but help had turned into something else entirely. That night he slept in his truck. He couldn't shake the guilt. Thing number 4, what Mark never showed the public. In later interviews, Mark revealed that much of what he filmed in Odd never made it online. There were moments, he said, that were too real, too raw. I couldn't share them. Not everything should be content. He described one instance where a visiting relative broke down crying when talking about the family's condition, the generational poverty, the fear of outsiders, the shame that had grown like a weed through the years. There were scenes of illness, of desperation, of simple acts of kindness that didn't translate well through a lens. Mark kept those private, believing that dignity mattered more than clicks. But that decision, too, fueled rumors. People began speculating about what he was hiding. Some accused him of editing the footage to make the family look worse than they were. In truth, Mark was doing the opposite. He was protecting them. Still, the line between respect and censorship blurred. And once again, the internet's hunger for content outweighed its patience for context. Thing number 5, the neighbor's revenge. The backlash wasn't limited to YouTube comments. Some locals started to retaliate in subtle ways. Signs appeared near the property warning visitors to keep out. A few residents threatened Mark directly, accusing him of bringing outsider chaos to their quiet lives. In one message he shared privately, someone wrote, "You think you're helping them, but you're just feeding the circus. Leave Odd alone." Mark ignored most of the threats, but he couldn't ignore what was happening to the family. Reports began surfacing online that strangers were trespassing, taking photos, even leaving notes on the porch. One woman posted a video of herself crying in front of their house, saying she just wanted to feel close to them. Mark called it compassion turned into voyeurism. He realized the story had escaped his control. Thing number 6, the real cost, the family's privacy. When the Whittakers first appeared online, they didn't understand that millions of strangers were watching them. They didn't know what YouTube was. They didn't grasp what viral meant. But they felt the consequences. Children at nearby schools started mocking their name. The family became a topic in classrooms, podcasts, and late-night live streams. It wasn't just about exposure anymore. It was about identity. Their name had become a brand, and not by choice. Mark knew it. He saw the toll it took each time he visited, the way they looked at him differently now. He wasn't just the man with the camera. He was the one who'd opened the door the world had never been meant to walk through. Still, he couldn't stop. He believed that if he continued documenting them responsibly, he could steer the story back toward empathy, away from exploitation. But not everyone agreed. Thing number 7, the turning point, a call that changed everything. It happened late one evening. Mark was home in California when he got a message from a local contact in West Virginia. The message was short. "You need to come back. There's trouble." When he arrived 2 days later, he found out that someone claiming to be a fan had tried to film the Whittakers without permission, entering the property, waving cash, and demanding an interview. The family was frightened. Larry reportedly chased the intruder off with a stick. Betty refused to come outside for hours afterward. Mark was furious. Not at the family, but at himself. He realized then that telling their story wasn't just about them anymore. It was about everyone who thought they had a right to it. That was the moment the entire project changed. From that point forward, Mark shifted his focus. He still documented the family, but he also began confronting the ethics of his own work, publicly questioning what it meant to help someone through exposure. He started saying it out loud. "If you're watching this just to stare, you're part of the problem." By the end of that visit, the mood in Odd had changed for good. The once silent hills now echoed with an unwanted kind of fame. The family had more comfort than before, running water, beds, electricity. But they had less peace. And Mark? He had a conscience heavy with contradictions. Because the truth was undeniable, his camera had saved them from invisibility, but also stolen their anonymity. In the next part, Mark begins to face the consequences of that revelation, the legal questions, the media backlash, and the emotional unraveling that would make him wonder if the Whittaker story had gone too far to ever be told again. Comment below. Now that the Whittakers' fame brought both help and harm, do you think Mark Laita should have stopped filming after the first video? Or did continuing their story give them the voice they never had before? When the world first met the Whittaker family, it was through the lens of curiosity. But by the time the story reached its third wave of exposure, that curiosity had turned into chaos. The line between awareness and exploitation had all but disappeared, and Mark Laita, the man who'd opened that window, found himself caught between two impossible roles, protector and provocateur. Mark had always said that the Whittakers were the most real people I've ever met. What he didn't say publicly, at least not then, was how much the reality of their fame had begun to crush them. The family had gone from isolation to global recognition in months. Donations poured in, their faces were plastered across thumbnails, and their names became hashtags. But the questions that followed, about money, manipulation, and morality, began to shadow everything. And for the first time, Mark wasn't just fighting public opinion. He was fighting to keep the family together. Thing number 1. The investigation nobody saw coming. In early 2023, a rumor started spreading online that state officials had visited the Whittaker property after receiving concerns about their welfare. No one could confirm who called it in, but whispers pointed toward the internet. Mark's inbox filled with messages claiming insiders had alerted authorities. Some blamed him for it. Others accused him of covering it up. What really happened was simpler and sadder. The sudden influx of visitors, cameras, and so-called helpers had put the family under scrutiny. Local law enforcement had to check on them. It wasn't a criminal investigation, it was a welfare one. But the internet twisted it into something else, a scandal. Mark was furious when he found out. Not at the authorities, but at the endless cycle of speculation that seemed determined to turn compassion into controversy. He flew to West Virginia again, driving straight from the airport to the dirt road that led to the family's home. The air was colder, the trees bare. When he pulled up, the front porch was empty. Larry eventually emerged, cautious but smiling. Betty followed, quieter than usual. They knew something had changed. They just couldn't explain it. "People been talking," Betty said, looking down at the ground. "On the computer. Saying things." Mark didn't have the heart to tell her how bad it had gotten. Thing number 2, the fight over money. While Mark was in odd, more posts began circulating online claiming that GoFundMe funds hadn't been distributed fairly. Some alleged that intermediaries, moderators, helpers, and even friends of the family had mishandled donations. Others said Mark had too much control over the account. The problem was, in part, logistical. The Whittakers didn't have bank accounts or digital access. Most of their transactions were handled in cash or through local vendors. That made transparency almost impossible to show online, even when Mark wanted to. He started posting updates again, this time with photos of supplies, invoices, and receipts. But no matter how much proof he shared, skeptics doubled down. One viral tweet read, "If this man really cared, he'd give them full control of their own money. This isn't charity, it's ownership." Mark responded once, "You can't give someone control of money they can't access or protect. You have to think about safety first." But his explanation did little to quiet the noise. In interviews later, Mark said, "People wanted a villain. They wanted someone to blame for their guilt about watching." Thing number 3, the family splits in two. Not physically, emotionally. The sudden pressure fractured relationships inside the home. Larry, always the most outspoken, wanted to embrace the attention. He liked when visitors came bearing gifts, even if they were strangers. Betty, however, wanted it all to stop. She was tired of questions, tired of cameras, tired of people showing up pretending to care. The tension between them grew with every new visit. Larry would invite Mark in warmly, Betty would retreat indoors. Mark felt the divide like a weight. He didn't want to be the reason they turned on each other, but he couldn't deny that his presence had changed the rhythm of their lives forever. One evening, as they sat outside eating sandwiches he'd brought, Betty finally spoke what had been sitting unsaid for months. "We was fine before," she said softly. "People laughed, sure. But they didn't come here. Now they all come. All want something." Mark wanted to argue, to say they weren't fine, that they deserved better. But looking around at the hills, the silence, and the chaos his cameras had brought, he couldn't. She was right. Thing number 4, the YouTube controversy. By the summer, another storm was brewing, this time over monetization. Mark's channel, Soft White Underbelly, had grown massively thanks to the Whittaker series. Every upload featuring them drew millions of views. And where there are views, there's money. Critics began asking whether Mark was paying the family for their appearances. Some demanded full profit sharing. Others argued that exposure itself was exploitative, regardless of payment. Mark clarified multiple times that he had compensated the family, both directly and indirectly, through home improvements, supplies, and ongoing care. But the internet didn't buy it. Comment sections flooded with anger. He's profiting off their pain. Why are they still living like that if he's making money? This is modern-day exploitation with better lighting. Mark tried to stay calm publicly, but behind the scenes, he was exhausted. He wasn't sleeping. He spent hours responding to emails, clarifying, defending. He began questioning his own intentions, something few creators ever do mid-success. In one rare unscripted moment on camera, he admitted, "I don't know if I did the right thing anymore. I wanted people to care, not consume." Thing number 5, a call from the state. In early fall, the situation took another turn. The state contacted Mark regarding zoning and housing issues around the family's home. The new structure built for them needed septic updates to comply with safety regulations. The cost? Nearly $5,000, money the family didn't have. For Mark, it felt like déjà vu, another reminder that good intentions often come with hidden costs. He helped fund part of the repair and tried to raise awareness again, but this time, the internet wasn't as generous. People were skeptical now, weary of the story. Donations slowed. Comments grew colder. He realized that online compassion has an expiration date. People move on. The next scandal, the next tragedy, the next viral heartbreak. The Whittakers, however, couldn't move on. They were still there, still living the same life, still caught in the echo of a story that refused to fade. Thing number 6, Mark's confession. During one of his later interviews, Mark admitted something that stunned his audience. He said that during his first visit back in 2004, he'd been warned not to photograph the Whittakers. Local officers had told him it was better to leave that family alone. He went anyway. "I thought I was documenting poverty," he said. "But I was documenting something else, neglect. Generational neglect that we all ignored." That admission reframed everything. It wasn't just about the family anymore. It was about society's collective failure to care for people like them before cameras ever showed up. He added quietly, "If I hadn't gone, nobody would have helped them. But maybe if I'd stayed away, they'd still have peace." It was a paradox he couldn't untangle, and one the internet refused to understand. Thing number 7, the lost footage. There was one final revelation Mark shared in private, months after the controversy peaked. He had footage, hours of it, that he'd never uploaded. In those clips, the family laughed, sang, told stories. They were joyful, not tragic. But he kept it hidden because, as he put it, the internet doesn't deserve their light if all it wants is their pain. He feared that uploading those moments would only invite mockery. So, the world never saw them. That decision, to withhold joy in order to protect dignity, revealed just how far the story had drifted from its original purpose. What had begun as documentation had turned into defense. By the end of that year, Mark was a different man. The Whittakers had changed too, older, more cautious, but also slightly better off. They had warmth, food, and the occasional visitor who came to help, not film. But their name, their faces, their story, they no longer belonged only to them. They belonged to the internet. And that was something no one could ever undo. Before leaving Odd for what he thought might be the last time, Mark stood at the edge of the property, camera off, hands in his pockets. The air was heavy and still. Larry waved from the porch. Timmy barked twice and smiled. Betty stayed inside. Mark whispered, almost to himself, maybe telling their story wasn't the mistake. maybe letting everyone else tell it was. In Part 4, Mark faces his hardest truth yet, that the Whittakers' story may have revealed more about us than it ever did about them. And the final question, can a family that never asked for fame survive the world's obsession long enough to find peace again? Comment below. Now that Mark has revealed the costs and contradictions behind the Whittakers' fame, do you think society helped them, or just turned their tragedy into another form of entertainment? By the time Mark Laita stepped away from Odd, West Virginia, the Whittaker story had become something larger than any one man could control. It began as a documentary, a quiet exploration of isolation and poverty, but it had grown into a cultural mirror, reflecting something uncomfortable about the people watching. The world claimed to care. Millions clicked, commented, donated, and debated. But few truly listened. Mark said it best during one of his last visits. They're not famous because they're different. They're famous because we are fascinated by what we don't understand. And that fascination came with consequences. The Whittakers had gained things they never imagined: new beds, running water, warmth. Yet they'd lost something that can't be replaced: anonymity. What once was private and sacred became shared and scrutinized by strangers. Every new video felt heavier, more complicated. Mark began spending less time filming and more time simply visiting, sitting on the porch with Larry, bringing groceries, talking quietly with Betty when she'd allow it. He still brought his camera, but he didn't always turn it on. He'd realized something the internet never would: the Whittakers didn't need to be seen anymore. They needed to be left alone. As the years went on, the noise surrounding their story began to fade. Other viral topics took over, and the endless debate about Mark's motives died down. But those who'd followed closely knew the truth: the Whittakers' lives had changed forever. Larry still spoke fondly of Mark. Timmy, in his own way, seemed to remember him every time he heard a car pull up. Betty stayed guarded, wary of anyone who might turn her home into content again. Mark continued to defend them long after the cameras stopped rolling. When asked in an interview if he regretted telling their story, he paused before answering. "I don't regret showing the world who they are. I regret what the world did with it." That single sentence captured the entire tragedy. Because the Whittakers weren't a spectacle, they were a reflection of forgotten America, of people abandoned by geography, poverty, and silence. And when the world finally noticed them, it was only because a lens made it impossible to look away. Mark's last filmed visit ended quietly. No dramatic reveal, no scripted goodbye, just a simple moment where Larry waved, Timmy barked, and Betty watched from behind the door. He got into his truck, turned the camera off, and whispered, "They're not the story. We are." The Whittakers remain in Odd, still living simply, still bound by family and habit. The cameras are gone now, but the questions remain, about empathy, exploitation, and what it really means to help. Comment below. Do you think the world learned compassion from the Whittaker story, or did it only expose how easily we turn pain into curiosity? Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.